Welcome to Storytime, brought to you by the OWSCyCon2019, the online book event of the year.
The rule of thumb regarding death: there are no rules. The obvious truth: there are no exemptions. Elena and William's father told them he had once cheated death. The pair now stood before the resulting retribution. 5 days ago, death came calling and collected its debt twice over. The siblings stood together, Elena lost in a lingering state of disbelief. Father Kent spoke solemnly behind them, but she wasn't listening. Small tendrils of her chestnut hair escaped from under her bergère and swirled in the cold breeze, obscuring her vision. They clung to the single tear rolling down her cheek. Absently, she tucked the damp pieces behind her ear. It was a pleasant spring morning in Newcastle, a rare occurrence this time of year. The mist and the clouds that weighed heavily over the city almost every day were non-existent this morning. A fine day to bury your parents, Elena reflected. Raucous caws drug her from her thoughts. She raised her head, searching. The raven blinked at her from its perch on a distant headstone. A dear friend had once told her a single raven appearing meant a truth to be revealed, and her heart lifted for a short moment. Were her parents sending them a sign, telling them there would be an answer for their deaths? She chanced a sideway glance at William. He too was watching the raven. The early morning sun shone off his black hair, seeming to create rivers of blue throughout. Such the picture of their father, tall and sophisticated. William stole a look at her and dropped his head, his jaw tense. Elena saw the devastation in his eyes every time she looked at him. It was not that her own heart was not broken. It was more so that the anger boiling inside her superseded anything else that she had been able to feel. She was angry at her parents and God. She was furious with herself and William for not escorting their parents on their trip to Edinburgh. William said they would be all dead if they had, as if that were the worst that could happen. She didn't care. In fact, she might prefer it. What in the hell were they going to do? Their parents had raised them across the ocean in the colonies. Now, 20 years later, they had been torn from the only life they had ever known and brought to this God-forsaken place and orphaned, abandoned. The 2 siblings were born here in England. The family had traveled overseas when Elena was 1 and William 3. Newcastle and their mother's home city of Edinburgh, a short distance away in Scotland, were both foreign to them. Her gaze rose away from the raven and past the confines of the kirkyard toward the ocean barely visible across the boggy moor. If she didn't know it was there, she would think it only a small hill in the distance. 4 short months ago, they had traveled across that ocean to their new home. Their grand adventure had turned into a nightmare, and she wished they had never made the journey. The cemetery and the smell of the freshly turned earth were suffocating. She could take no more, and she would be damned if any of these strangers behind her would see her cry. Squaring her shoulders, she crossed herself and in a swirl of petticoats turned, leaving William where he stood, and made her way through the small gathering towards the waiting family coach. Lady Elena. A squat, round man stepped forward and reached out a hand to stop her. He was clad in a deep plum velvet ensemble with a pale lavender waistcoat. His dark eyes seemed to bulge from beneath his thick brows. Absently, she wondered if his cravat was too tight, and resisted the urge to reach up and adjust it for him. He dabbed his ruddy face with an already damp handkerchief, sweating more than anyone should that early in the morning. The sun was shining, but the air was chilled nonetheless. "I am sorry for your loss, my lady," he said. Casting her eyes down and blinking to clear the grief that clouded her vision, she took in the man's hand resting on her arm. It was curiously small and elegant, not fitting at all with the body it was attached to. She knew she should know him, but didn't have the strength to pull his identity from the storm of thoughts swirling about in her head. Nodding, with a small, and what she hoped was a sincere-looking smile, she patted his hand still resting on her arm. Not knowing, not particularly caring if he had finished his condolences, she turned away. Only when she reached the seclusion of the family carriage did she release the false mask of self-assurance she had held in place for the last hour. Letting the uncertainty and fear escape from her body with a shudder, she buried her face in her hands. She didn't know how long she sat before formal expressions of gratitude and goodbyes drifted through her private sanctuary. A twinge of guilt pierced her heart at leaving the pleasantries to William. The carriage swayed as a shadow fell across the open doorway, and her brother, her rock, stepped inside. William nodded to the groomsman as he closed and latched the door. He turned his bloodshot eyes to her, and she flung herself at him, arms about his neck as he took the seat next to her, and she wept for the first time since learning of their parents' deaths. Removing her cap and laying it next to his cocked hat, he gathered her in his arms. "Release it, Elena. There is no weakness in grieving," he whispered into her hair, laying his cheek against the crown of her head. "Everything will be all right." "How?" she sobbed into his chest. He didn't answer, but he held her close as the carriage bumped its way swiftly down the uneven road. The silence of the morning disturbed only by the sound of the horses' hoofs, their occasional whinnying, and her hiccuping sobs. The carriage turned onto the lane that led to the sprawling manse that they had called their home for the past 4 months. A myriad of fruit trees lined the winding drive to the house and was in full bloom, their delicate mix of pink and white flowers too cheerful for this somber day. Their mother had loved them, and it pierced Elena's heart to look at them. Her eyes roamed the grounds of the estate. All of this was now William's responsibility. He was a lieutenant and an earl in a strange country. She could not imagine the pressure and uncertainty that he must harbor inside. She knew he was trying to be strong for her, but she also knew how scared she was for their future. Their parents' killers were still out there. The authorities thought it highway robbery, but Elena and William were convinced it was more sinister than that. Their parents' jewelry and belongings were still on their person. The authorities knew this as well, and that concerned the pair even more. Did they think them naive and simple because they were from the colonies? Did they genuinely believe that they were as stupid as to believe it was robbery and nothing more? What exactly were they trying to hide? And who would want their parents dead so soon after returning to their home countries? Elena collapsed onto her brother's lap, and he slid his handkerchief from the sleeve of his uniform, placing it into her curled fist resting on his knee. "What shall we do?" she whispered, dabbing at her burning eyes and wiping her dripping nose, trying to pull herself together. "I don't know," he whispered. Elena's eyes roamed the interior of the carriage until they came to rest on the crumpled bouquet of previously white lilies that had slid from her grasp onto the dirty carriage floor. She had forgotten to lay them on her mother's grave. The once delicate ivory petals had wilted in her desperate grip and were now tinged a rusty red from the dirt and mud lingering in the bottom of the carriage. They seemed the perfect metaphor for their newly upended, messy lives.
This story time was read by Virginia Calloway Stark and brought to you in conjunction with the OWSCyCon 2019. OWSCyCon runs from May 17th through May 19th. You can find us at OWSCyCon.OurRightSide.com. Again, OWSCyCon.OurRightSide.com. We have events happening across all genres. If you are a reader, you cannot afford to miss this event. You never know. You may just find your next best read.